So that's my vote. So on that note, it looks like our attendance is filing in and holding steady. So I'm going to go ahead and get us officially started. So welcome to session 1 of the 20th Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. NWILL wishes to acknowledge that the territory called North America, now primarily occupied by descendants of European colonizers and other immigrants, is the rightful land of Indigenous, Native American, and First Nations populations. We are all responsible for understanding the history and colonization of genocide of Indigenous people and must commit to learning, building relationships, sharing stories, and taking action to support Indigenous sovereignty, priorities, and actions. We encourage you to learn about the Indigenous peoples to whom the land you occupy rightfully belongs. Please visit the document section of the conference platform to learn more, or the NWILL website. Today's date is September 1st, 2021, and this session is titled Sharing Democracy, U.S. Government Information 101 for ILL Professionals, and will be presented by Will Stringfellow from Vanderbilt University. My name is Miriam Wnuk, and I am the convener for this session. This session is being recorded with permission from the presenter. They retain the copyright to the information they are presenting and may request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to the NWILL committee chairperson. However, at this time, it is planned that recordings will be available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn live captioning on, click the CC link at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitle. If you have a question during the session, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will pose these to the presenter at the end of this presentation. The door prize keyword will be revealed between the presentation and Q&A, or hopefully not at the end, assuming I don't forget. Please see the door prize link in the event menu. When the Zoom webinar ends, please complete the post-session survey in Event Mobi located at the bottom of the session page. There's just one question and is a session feedback at the bottom. On that note, I will turn the session over to our presenters. Our presenter, Will Stringfellow.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you so much to everyone attending. I'm really excited to share some information with you all, and welcome to Sharing Democracy, U.S. Government Information 101 for ILL professionals. And I left out resource sharing professionals as well, but you all are included as well. I'm Will Stringfellow, the Government Documents Coordinator at Vanderbilt University, and I'm also the current chair of the Depository Library Council. For this session, we're going to look a little bit about general information of government information. We're going to talk a bit about the Federal Depository Library Program. We're going to cover the SuDoc classification system, and then we're going to talk about some of the issues that you as interlibrary loan and resource sharing professionals will face, and hopefully help you all navigate some of these tricky waters to help fill more requests and make this information more available. Well, we got a lot to cover, so let's get rolling. All right, so our first thing we need to start with is kind of the basic of what is government information. And one of the things that throughout my career I found is that government information is kind of difficult to define. So this definition that I've kind of pulled from quite a few different sources is essentially government information is any information created, compiled, disseminated, or published by a government entity. Now, normally this information is at a taxpayer expense, and it's information that's published that is the government in the course of its work. So someone out that's campaigning, for instance, to become a politician, that's not government information, but the work they do on the floor of the House or the Senate would be considered government information. So it's the things that the government does in the course of its work. Now, one of the things about government, and one thing I do want to point out, when I say government entity, there are all sorts of government entities. So if you think about your towns, your municipalities, a county, a state, think of a country like the United States, and then think of other countries, you know, Germany, for instance, or Australia, and they have their own government entities. So there's a lot of different government entities. A lot of them produce massive amounts of information. So what is government information not? Well, one thing it is not is it's government information is not a subject, but it is a type or more of a genre of information. So when we start thinking about the topics that are covered, We commonly think of things like, for instance, census and scientific data, and that's both hard science data and social science data. A lot of research, and many times it's scientific, non-scientific, and social sciences and general research. When we also think about laws, regulations, and that's kind of a common thing for government information, and it's applicable to just about anyone that interacts with any government. And then there's also educational information. So this could be a range of things, anywhere from travel information, health information, fitness. We also think of things, for instance, how to build a house, and just kind of general information. And then finally, let's not forget forms. What's commonly comes across are things like tax forms, and that falls under is government information. Now, something that's really important when we think of government information, there's really two different types that I usually like to use. And the first is going to be tangible. And when I talk about tangible government information, that is government information that is in a physical form. So already we're going to think of books, and that could be hard, softback, microfiche. So those are kind of the two common ones, pamphlets. And then we get into things like CD and DVD ROMs. Now, those are electronically accessed. You have to utilize a computer or workstation, but because the information itself is on a physical item, a CD or DVD ROM, it's considered a tangible document or tangible form of information. The other type that we refer to are online information, and those are government information that are accessible usually via a web link or a Perl, and you don't actually have a physical piece that you are accessing, that the user access that you provide. So the thing that I want you to take away is there's lots of governments, and they produce lots of information. If you start to think about all of the governments and all of the information, you're going to get a little bit sick because you start thinking about infinity, because it's just so much information. But I've got some great news. We're only going to deal with one government today, although it's a large government. We're going to just stick with one of them. And the government we're going to look at is going to be the United States federal government and the information from there. So let's talk a little bit about federal information. Now, some of the information is published and distributed by the Government Publishing Office. They are a legislative branch agency, and a lot of the information is actually distributed through what's called the Federal Depository Library Program, or FDLP. Now, I'm going to go in depth on the FDLP in just a moment, but the other information is also not distributed through GPO, and it's also not distributed through the FDLP. And actually quite a bit of government information is self-published by government entities. And when I say a government entity, I'm talking about the constituent parts that make up the government. So your agencies and bureaus and offices, and any way that they're kind of defined and labeled throughout the federal government, they will self-publish. They will sometimes have other printers produce their materials, and a lot of that information is self-published online and born digital. Now, for U.S. federal information, generally, we're going to talk about information that falls under all three branches of the government, so executive, legislative, and judicial. However, I do want to point out that some judicial information is a little tricky, especially certain court rulings, and those have exceptions for how they have to be accessed. Now, once again, as I mentioned before, government information is not a topic. It's not a subject. So federal information covers many topics. And in fact, it covers so many that I'm not going to list them for you. Here's the challenge that I bring. And normally some may say, well, bring me a topic and let's see if I can find you some federal information. That's not how I approach it. My challenge is, can you bring me a topic that I cannot find you government information? And this is a challenge that I bring to every professional, every user when I'm speaking about government information, and no one has been able to stump me on that one yet. So lots of topics, everything from your sciences to education, social sciences, the whole gamut, and even things that deal with the arts and such. So another thing that I do want to point out is a lot of government information is also available for purchase from the Government Publishing Office. And there's also non-governmental commercial publishers that also reproduce this information and will republish it, and they will sell access to that information. And one of the reasons why, and it's kind of something that benefits, especially in the ILL and resource sharing part of the profession, is that federal information is exempt from copyright. And if we look at Section 105 of the Title 17 of the United States Code, there is an exemption for federal government information. So it's exempt from copyright. So you can reproduce it and reuse it without having to worry about copyright. Now, there are a handful of exceptions, and those are usually very clearly marked. But I want to point out and emphasize, this only applies to federal information. If you get into state information, or local municipalities within the United States even, those are not exempt from copyright, and some of those entities will reserve their copyright. So you must be very cautious when you're working with non-federal information. And the last thing about the general information on federal information is that most of it actually utilizes a different call number classification system, and they utilize what is called the Superintendent of Documents classification, or SuDoc. Now, I'm going to go in depth on SuDoc later on, but I want to go ahead and emphasize SuDoc is provenance based on the issuing entity from the government. So the entity in the government that actually produces the information is how it's organized. It is not based upon subject, although you may be able to infer based upon the entity itself. It is not a subject-based classification system. So I want to go ahead and plant that seed. Okay, so we got a little bit about federal information. Let's talk about the Federal Depository Library Program. So the Federal Depository Library Program, or FDLP, is essentially a system of federal depository libraries, or FDLs, who are congressionally designated to receive federal information, federal documents from the government publishing office. Now, these FDLs receive federal publications free of charge, but there's always some strings attached. And what these strings are, and we'll just say they're more requirements rather than strings, is that these FDLs must offer free public access to the collections received through the Federal Depository Library Program. Another part is that these materials are paid for by taxpayers. They are actually property of the federal government, not the housing libraries. So what that means is that the access is different, even in places for libraries which may have access restrictions based upon age or certain, so for instance, if you have a library that only allows people who are 18 and up, well, if someone who is 15 would like to come in and utilize the federal collection, that library must provide mitigated access. Discarding these materials also become different because, once again, the library themselves, the library does not own them. The federal government still owns them. And of course, now these, the requirements and laws and such do not apply to purchased materials. These are only materials received through the Federal Depository Library Program. Now, I do want to point out the FDLP is actually codified in federal law, and it is in Chapter 19 of Title 44 of the United States Code. Currently in the United States, and this includes not just the, this also includes the territories and Hawaii, so not just the continental United States, there are 1,116 federal depository libraries. And while it is codified in federal law, we're also governed by what are called the legal requirements and program regulations of the Federal Depository Library Program, also known as LRPR, much easier to say. Now, the great news is, as ILL professionals and resource sharing professionals, you really don't need to know LRPR. But that's where we kind of base a lot of this stuff out of. And if you are looking for more information about that, it's easily accessible. I'm happy to help hook you up with that information. Okay, so speaking of federal depository libraries, there are two different types. There are what are called regionals, and there are what are called selectives. So a regional receives a senatorial designation, and many states have one regional, although they can have up to 2 by law, but no more. Some states have no regionals and are not served at all by a regional, and some states actually share regionals. So you may have multiple states that are served by a single regional. So it does vary. So what does a regional do? Well, a regional is required to select and retain one tangible version of every publication distributed through the FDLP. So what that means is that if there's a book, a microfilm, microfiche, and a CD-ROM of a single title that is distributed, the regional is required to take one version of those, and they must retain that essentially in perpetuity. So generally, regionals cannot discard documents. Now, there are a handful of exceptions, such as for certain superseded materials, and there are certain designated titles, but those are very, very rare. So it's best to think of regionals cannot discard. They have to take one of everything. So they have very large collections. Additionally, the other thing that regionals are responsible for, and this is directly from the title code, is within the region served, and the region served is usually the state or a couple of states or several states. They provide interlibrary loan, they provide reference services, and they also assist in depository libraries with the disposal of unwanted government publications. And what that means is that they actually oversee the withdrawal process. Now, you may think, well, regionals can't withdraw. So what do you mean withdrawal process? Well, when we get to selectives, I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But the thing to take away from the regionals is they are really kind of the responsible library for a region or a state, and they're going to have the most comprehensive collections, especially the older regional libraries, because they are unable to discard and have to take one of everything. Now, let's look at selectives. Now, these receive House or senatorial designations. Now, the difference is, though, they may select, although they don't have to, one tangible version of every publication or series that are distributed through the FDLP. I want to point out, though, they don't have to, and in fact, there are some federal depository libraries that are entirely online. They do not receive any tangible publications. Now, the other part that's really interesting or unique about selectives is that they must retain for the minimum retention period, but eventually are able to discard. So what that means is in most cases, selectives must retain materials for for a minimum of 5 years. And then after with permission from the regional serving their area, they are able to discard after offering to other depositories within the state or area or region, and then to other libraries. And so what that means is that their collections are going to be less comprehensive, but a bit more topically scoped. And so, for instance, research libraries associated with the university may have collections that are going to really support their academic research. So if you look at a region or a state, if you take all of the depositories in a state or a region, you put those together and you have a collection, a somewhat comprehensive collection amongst those libraries. So now's the time for a quick poll that I have, and I'm going to ask for Miriam to put up our poll question. And so we'll do this really quickly. And it's, is the library you work for a federal depository library? And the options are yes, no, or I don't know. And so maybe we'll give this 20 seconds or so to answer. All right. Okay, wonderful. So thank you all so much for responding. Great response. So I see about half of the attendees here are members of a federal depository library, and a good chunk are not. Wow, that's a significant amount. All right, well, I got some great news. I can help out. I've got some information for both all of the professionals in depository libraries and those that aren't. So for those of you that are in a depository library, get to know your depository coordinator. They are very knowledgeable in the makeup of the government and government information. We love to help out. And it's one of those things that as a community, and I suspect it's the same for the interlibrary loan resource sharing community, is when there's reference questions that we can't answer, we go to the national community and we all work together, and we love assisting elsewhere. So get to know your depository coordinator. They are the experts that can help you navigate. Now, if you're not in a depository library, that's okay. But I've got some advice for you. And the advice is figure out who the federal depository libraries are in your region, area, or state, and especially get to know the regionals, because they're going to be the ones that are responsible for the interlibrary loan in that state or region. And get to know the selectives in your area as well, because once again, this is all a big network and we can all help each other out. So the question is how on earth do you find your federal depository library? So if you go to this link that I put into the slide here, it's going to take you to the Federal Depository Library Directory. And let's bring up our next. And so now I didn't go to the link I'm using because it's a slideshow. These are going to be screenshots, but it's straight from the page. If you go to the directory, you're going to see this, and you can either click on the map and click your state, or you can utilize the basic search to find the depositories near you. And what you'll do is that after you click, so if, let's say I click on Tennessee, this is what you're going to get is your search results of all of the depositories in that area, or the region, or the state or area. And within those, It's going to give you a little bit of basic information, such as the library and where they are located, the city and state. And you're also going to get to see the depository status of whether they're a selective or a regional. Now, if you go through and you click the view button, you can get a lot more details about each of the depositories. This is a great way to find out who your depositories are. And if you can talk to one of those depositories, they can network you with those other depositories. But for those who are not served by or who do not work at a Federal Depository Library, please reach out to those regional libraries or the ones in your area. They're an invaluable resource and can help you out through this process. So now that we've gone over how to find Federal Depository Library collections, well, let's talk about how on earth do you find Federal Depository documents, especially when you're utilizing SuDoc. So SuDoc, or Superintendent of Documents classification, and as I said before, it is provenance, not subject-based. You gotta, and so I know it's very different for most of our library classification systems, and that's okay. But if you can understand this part, it'll help you finding these materials, whether you're in a library or you're requesting these materials. So the next part is this is not a decimal system, which for me is great. Long decimals I really struggle with. I love that it's not a decimal system. Now, there are periods that are used and there's punctuation, but in no case will you ever see decimals in SuDoc. Another thing that's really important is that you're going to find that there is a colon in SuDoc. Well, no other classification system uses colons. So if you see a colon, you know that you're working with SuDocs. And so I'm going to break this down a little bit and give you a little bit of details of how it works. So let's see here if I can pull up a spotlight. So this right here is a full SuDoc number. And what you're seeing is two parts. So in our example right here of the A13150 W64, everything up until the colon, so from the A all the way to the 150 is what is referred to as the stem. And the stem is generally going to be the provenance information. Everything after the colon is the suffix, and the suffix is really the information that helps to disambiguate and identify the document. So let's go a little bit in depth here. Using our example here, and this is a real example, and I am utilizing the GPO classification guidelines for this. So this is where the example comes from. When we start to break this down, all SuDocs will begin with an uppercase letter. And what this uppercase letter does, so in our example, the A, this is the big issuing department or the agency. Now, not all of the entities are going to be departments. So you have, for instance, Congress, which uses X or Y's. You have independent agencies, which will have their own. But generally, think of these as kind of the top level. So in this case, Department of Agriculture, a cabinet level executive branch. So that's the big group. Now, in the Department of Agriculture, there's all sorts of other entities. So the first number that follows the letter will give you the agency or subordinate office. So in our example here, the 13 means the Forest Service within the Department of Agriculture. Once you get up to the first period, and we'll just clear this off here and go to our next slide. Whoops. And my apologies. Let's clear all my drawings. There we go. So after the period, actually, so still in the stem, designates the category of the publication, or it could be a series or serial title. So in this case, the 150 that we see here stands for Southern Research Station General Publications. So any general publication that comes from the Southern Research Station is going to have that 150. And so that is what makes up our stem. So if we go back, it's Department of Agriculture, it's the Forest Service within the Department of Agriculture, and here is the type of publication. So we've discussed the stems. Now we'll discuss the suffix. Now suffixes will utilize letters and numbers, and they identify the specific publication. So in our example of the A13150, the W64, the W64 actually identifies the publication. In this case is the Wildflowers of the Savannah River site. Now, there are three possibilities for suffixes that, and they can either be done as years, which I'm going to speak about in just a second, letters, which is exactly what our example here has, and sometimes they're numbers. And so as we can see in my third example provided here, the 67 is a volume, and then the number is 2. So those are just literal numbers, 67, 2. Now, one of the things I do want to point out with the years is years are represented uniquely. So in this is how you disambiguate them from just numbers. Anything before 2000, it will be the last 3 digits of the year. So in our example down here, for 1998, you will use 998. For 1887, you would use 887. And for anything that is after 2000, we utilize all 4 digits. So 2010 is 2010, 2021 is 2021. One of the things you may run across, especially if you're pulling items for request, if you're going to those SuDoc stacks, now you may have similar stems, and not all of the documents are going to necessarily utilize the same, whether they utilize years, numbers, or letters. So in a case of ordering, if you don't know, if you run across a bunch of documents and you're not sure what the order is and the stems are all the same, start with years, then you'll go to letters, and then you'll go to numbers following that. Most libraries use that, but not necessarily every library will, but that is the general standard that's utilized. Okay, so let's keep on trucking. We're going to move on to some of the challenges now that we know a bit about SuDoc. Well, speaking of SuDoc, most libraries do utilize SuDoc for their federal documents, but not all of them. So you will see other classification schemes. You'll see the subject-based DOI and LC. Those are usually going to be associated with other older publications and historic publications, but also science. Hard sciences will class some new documents with LC, and that is common or somewhat common. Additionally, shelved by title you may find in law libraries, especially with new legislation and new court rulings that come out. So when we start talking about challenges, the organization of the federal government changes with every administration. So anytime you have a new president, they will create new government entities. They may get rid of some may sunset, some of them may have name changes, their responsibilities may change. So with this, the publications that they come out will change. And I'm going to go in depth for some tips for how can you track this and make it a little easier to find better, make better requests as well on this. Additionally, so another challenge, the US federal government produces tons of monographic serials and lots of numbered sets. And because of that, there are going to be certain ways that can help you identify certain items. And so there are some tricks for those. Format matters, and it does. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of information that comes out in different formats, and I'm going to discuss a bit of those as well with you all. And finally, there's a lot of titles that are old and rare, and some of them are historically significant. So lending becomes a little tricky with those titles. Okay, so let's move on to the ever-changing government. So the ever-changing government, yeah, this is one of those things that we deal with all the time. And whether it's looking for requests or whether it's on the government information. So there's a couple of things that will really help you out. And the first part is dates matter. So a couple of things will happen. As I mentioned, the government is always changing. So because of that, your titles may change over time. Now, they will use, many times they will get different bibliographic records. Sometimes they don't. And so these are things that you're going to want to pay attention to. So one of them is looking for titles and title changes. And like I said, refer to the dates. That's going to really help you out. So if you have a request, if for a specific item and it doesn't necessarily meet the date for the record they requested, you may need to go forward or back in time. Additionally, SuDoc classification may change because although the title may not change, there may be a different entity even within a even within a department that takes upon the responsibility of that title. So for example, climatological data for Tennessee, 1948 to 1965 was by the Weather Bureau in the Department of Commerce. So their SuDocs start with C30-1837. However, once we get to 66 through 1975, the Environmental Data Service out of NOAA takes that over, and that's a different call number classification. So it's C55-214-40. So what it means in this case is that this title, which continues, and 66 is continuing directly from 65, may be shelved in 2 entirely different areas. So how can you find this information? Well, one of the cool parts is I found talking with the interlibrary loan professionals at our institution is you all utilize a lot of mark fields. So here are the mark fields that will help you. Is that if your dates are not matching with your request, look at the mark 780 field. Those will indicate earlier titles or preceding titles. And then if you need to go forward in time, look for the Mark 785 field and look for the later title or succeeding title. And many times you'll also see an OCLC number that'll help you identify the correct title record for that request. Now, I want to point out, some class changes will be on the same title record, so it's not always consistent. So let's look at a couple of examples. So this right here is the livestock and meat situation. And if we look up at our year, and I'm going to pull back up our, I like the spotlight. Let's utilize our spotlight. For 1947 to 1980, livestock and meat situation is the title. However, if someone requests 1940, well, you're probably going to want to look at the earlier title. And if we look down here at the bottom, and this is, I understand, not the mark view, but this is the descriptive view. We're going to look down and look at this different title, livestock and wool situation. Well, that's a very different title. And it's going to, so if you find that someone's looking for that 1940s, you're going to want to go back in time and look at this earlier record. Or if we notice later, look at the later title, livestock and meat outlook and situation. So that's something to be aware of, is make sure that your dates are matching. Okay. And let's look at our next one. So remember our climatological data, Tennessee. So if we do a title search or keyword search, I've gone ahead and highlighted the 3 different dates. And if we look down at the bottom at number 7, it's 1948 to 1965. Once again, its own record. Well, it then goes to 1966 to 1975. And if you look next to them, you're going to notice different issuing agencies. So Weather Bureau for the earlier one, Environmental Data Service for the middle. And then after 1976, we see it's on a different record, and that's the National Climatic Center. So what do these records look like? Well, once again, and I do apologize, the screenshots may be very little, and I'm happy to share the slides after so you all can take a deeper dive into these. Please notice, once again, the years are clearly defined, and we notice our SuDoc number down here. And by the way, SuDoc is an 086 field for the mark fields. We do notice, so 1966 to 75, and we have C55 to 21440. Now, if someone were requesting 1960, we would go back and, so I know we magically went back to the preceding record, and we have 1940 to 65, and notice the different SuDoc number. Now, the final example I want to show you is the economic report of the president. And what I wanted to point out with this one is this started in 1950, and yes, I did cut this record in half. It's very long, but I wanted to point out down at the bottom, if you look at all of the SuDoc classifications, this did not get brand new title records, and each of the SuDoc numbers that you're seeing down here at the bottom, those are all going to be, so all of these down here are all going to be new presidents. So as we have a new administration, a new SuDoc number was added. However, it did not get its own title record. So you will see them in multiple ways. And once again, pay attention to your dates. Okay, so serials and numbered sets. So once again, the federal government, they produce lots of monographic serials and numbered sets. So when you're dealing with monographic serials, you may want to look at both the serial and the monographic records, because libraries will utilize both. Here at Vanderbilt, we utilize both. We utilize many times serial records, and we will put the summary information of our holdings, but then we will also add the monographic records for each item. If you're trying to find the specific item, in our case, many times it's a little easier to find it on the monographic record, and I'll show you a couple of examples, but you want to utilize both because libraries may be utilizing both of those. Additionally, numbered sets may contain hundreds of different options, and there are not additional monographic records for those because they are numbered sets. And so specifying needed volumes or parts can be very helpful. So let's look at a couple of examples. So first we have NASA SP, or NASA, the serial publications. And if we look here, we don't even see a SuDoc number down in the bottom. And we just have, if we look at our spotlight here, we're going to notice 1962 to whenever. I will tell you this this publication has thousands of titles with it, quite a few. So if you're trying to request a specific item, you're going to, users are going to have a lot of trouble with this. So let me give you an example of what one of the monographs looks like. And if you notice, our symbol is tagged with both of these records, and this is the Third Earth Resources Technology Satellite 1 Symposium. You never would have found this just off that serial record. But if we look down, we can see our class descriptor. So we've actually got our SuDoc numbers. And so this is a way that can help you find and make those better requests. But this is just something to be aware of both of these records may get used. Okay, so let's look at a quick numbered set. And this is one from an actual request that we received, which is the 1980 Census of Population and Housing. And these are block statistics and these are maps. If you notice in the contents, there are 380 different maps associated. And these are not individual maps. These are boxes or folders of maps which may have 40 or 60 maps within these. So if you send a request just with this OCLC number and you don't specify what you need, first of all, the library may not have this because this is a lot of maps. And secondly, there's no way we could fill this borrowing request. I would love to, but I just don't, we don't know what you need here. And so in this case, if you run across a record like this, try to provide specific information on that borrowing request. If you receive one of these requests, you know, and you don't have that detailed information added, you may want to reach out to the requesting library and ask, well, what is the user actually needing? Because if not, if you don't have this information, these requests may get passed on to, passed on to the next library in the lending string and eventually go unfilled. So adding that additional detail is really helpful, and especially when you have this many items associated with the title record. Okay, so we're almost done and getting ready for some questions. Format matters, and one of the things, as I mentioned before, the same title may come as a book, a microfiche, and a CD or DVD-ROM. So libraries and users may need a specific format. A library that has microfiche may want that print version of it, or they may want a CD or DVD-ROM, and that's because some of those formats are much easier to read and provide more detail. So the old cataloging practice was that multiple formats were on the same title record. So if you had a book, a microfiche, and a CD-ROM, they all wound up on the same record. And in those cases, you may need to specify format, or you may need to consult with the request to find out what is actually needed and what is available on the lending end as well. Now, the current practice is that individual formats each receive their own individual title records. So for newer records and newer items, you're going to see individual title records. Now, one of the things that if you have a format-specific request, look down at the 776 mark field, and this will tell you of other records that have the additional form entry. And if there is an additional record, so if a user needs that book and you're on a microfiche record, you can identify that, and there's usually an OCLC number as well. And just really quickly, here's what one of those records looks like that shares all of the different formats. And the way that you can tell in this case, which is, and this is a little tricky, is because of the Federal Register. If we look down here under the notes, you're going to notice volumes for 1985 distributed to some depository libraries on microfiche. One other thing is that you'll notice there are other formats available: microfiche, online version, CD-ROM version, but there's no OCLC numbers to link to those. So now there may be some that are created retrospectively, but this is one that even here at Vanderbilt, we've got all different formats on this record. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay, finally, let's talk about rare titles. So government, federal government's been producing and distributing information since 1813. What this means is there's a lot of information out there. A lot of them may be rare, historically significant, and just because of their age, there may be condition issues. So here's kind of a list of some items that libraries are less likely to circulate or lend physically. So anything that's an original census document, a decennial census, most likely originals do not circulate and will most likely probably not be lent, although someone might, but there are reprints available. Additionally, anything that's in the U.S. Congressional Serial Set. Now, this is something that's a huge set. It's 3/5 of a mile long. It contains all sorts of congressional legislative materials that are really important for research. And they're only available in the serial set. So a lot of requests may request items within the serial set, but if it's a part of the congressional serial set, libraries tend to not lend those because the comprehensive sets, which there are very few of across in existence, are very, very important, very rare materials. Maps, there's a lot of historic maps and they're hard to share. So once again, that's one of those that libraries are probably less likely to share. And also older congressional documents, so hearings and things like that, because of the same reasons with census documents. Now, what does that mean? That does not mean that they're not inaccessible, but what it does mean is that they may get automatically declined due to circulation policies. So if you run into some of these materials, you may want to reach out to the government documents coordinator, the government documents librarian, or their department and speak with them about conditional lending, or see if there's any mitigated lending they can do. In many cases, some exceptions can be made. I know with a lot of our stuff here at Vanderbilt that we don't necessarily circulate, we will do our best to provide mitigated access, but you got to kind of reach out to us, because it's, you know, and our ILL resource sharing is really good about speaking with us to figure out how can we provide that mitigated access. So I've got just some real quick final tips for you all. The first is limit direct request for government documents if you're able to do that. The reason being is that you don't want stuff just automatically ending. You know, that's kind of, if it just declines your request, well, you know, you may need to make conditional request. And so the ability to look at these requests and consult with government documents professionals can really help you out. And that's kind of the second thing. Get to know your FDLs. If you're in one, get to know those professionals. And if you're not in one, get to know the FDLs and the professionals in your surrounding area. We'd love to help. We want to help you out. Let's build those relationships. Additionally, pay attention to that format and detail. I'm sorry, format and dates. Super critical to finding the correct catalog record, which will help you find and help us provide you know, these resources to requesters. And finally, provide as much detail as possible. That's a great way to ensure and help ensure that some of these requests can be filled. Even if we're not able to send the physical item, it can help us find and maybe scan and digitize some of these materials and make those available to requesters. So here are some of the resources that I consulted. And once again, like I said, I'm happy to share the slides so you all will have an opportunity to view a few of the things that I've worked with. And at this time, I'm happy to open up to questions if we have time available. And I'm going to go ahead and stop my sharing so I can see what's going on.
I'm really quickly going to do a screen share so that people can see our code work here. And actually in theme with the government here, our state national park for this session is this international park was built on the international boundary between Canada and the United States and has an arch which symbolizes a lasting peace between the two countries. And that is Peace Arch National Park. And it is another one that I have been to. A little interesting fact, during the pandemic, it was one of the few places that people who are friends and relatives between Washington and Canada could actually meet. So I think in the news there were several people who got married at the Peace Arch during the pandemic. So there's that. I also want to add in a little note that you had some glowing notes going on in the chat here. And my opinion is, Will, that you could probably teach a class, a LAS class on GovDocs. So the first question we have here, and we only have a few minutes, is how does the FDLP determine which information goes to which libraries?
That's a great question. So in terms of, well, for a regional, they don't have a choice. They have to take anything that's distributed. They've got to take one format. So they don't have a choice in it. They just can select the format. For selectives, they basically choose. There's a list of options that are available. We call them item numbers, and they're associated with a title, a serial title, or a type of government publication. And the selective can choose which ones they want to select, and you do that once a year. So it's really up to the selective to decide which one, and it depends.
And we have a question that directly relates to ILL. Do the FDLP public access requirements extend to interlibrary loan and document delivery? For example, if somebody requests access to a 600-page document that we cannot circulate, are we required to scan the material for the requesting library or patron?
Ooh, that's a great question, and that's a really tricky one. So that's one that First, I would say definitely reach out to GPO and check out with an outreach librarian, because they can give you kind of a much more authoritative answer to that. Generally, if you for regionals, they generally have to provide some type of mitigated access. So it would be something like scanning those materials for the area that they are responsible for. That would generally be the case, but I would check with an outreach librarian on that to make sure it doesn't violate any of the access, because most of the access requirements are intended for your state or region. For a selective, that gets into a different that's a different question. Once again, I would ask a GPO outreach librarian, because they can give you authoritative answers. So sorry, I can't answer that one as clearly as I could. But generally, I would think a regional would be more responsible for that, most likely.
Okay. Oh, this. Okay. So we got a try to stump the presenter question. What type of data do you have for Indigenous tribes? Do you have a digitized national archive with photographs for Indigenous groups?
The federal government, I suspect, does. Although I do not work for the federal government, and I do not represent them in any way, shape, or form. So now we do have, there is data available. Some of it's in congressional hearings and congressional materials. Yes, we do have that. We also do have some other publications that are available. So yes, we do have the specifics on it. There's one of the well-known ones is what's called the North American Handbook on Native American Indians, I believe is the title, North American Indians. Yeah, that is the title. It's a kind of a general reference that's utilized. But yes, I mean, there is all sorts of stuff that's available. There is data. We do have some of it. I would have to do a serious search to find some of it. And but the Department of Interior has done quite a bit as well. So that would be one that would have a lot of that information. And there are specific government entities that work with indigenous people for North America, and they do have information available. But for specifics, yeah, I'd have to do some research and get it for you.
Okay. And I'm going to do one more question. Are changes in title or in SuDoc ever politically motivated? Do administrators try to bury information?
So I would say that's a stump question right there.
Puts you in a tough situation. I know.
You would have to ask the federal government about that, but no, generally the SuDoc. So SuDoc classification is purely based upon whoever it is that is. It's the structure of the government, which the GPO librarians do not have any say in that. So they would not change something like that. Now, are agencies and entities created? Well, I suspect there are political motivations behind that, but that wouldn't be GPO. I mean, that's going to be the entity itself or a politician involved. But no, not to my knowledge, that's never the intent behind SuDoc. Yeah, I mean, they literally can just look at the makeup of the government. In terms of burying information, so now that does happen. That's usually certain agencies will remove content, and that's kind of the question. That's one of the things we run into more, is that for information it's what's called unreported documents and unreported information. So government entities are supposed to notify government publishing when they publish something, so government publishing can create a title record for that information. Now, it doesn't mean that they need to republish it, but they will usually link to it and create a title record as part of title and indexing. And so for the unreported publications, so GPO doesn't necessarily know what's being created because there's lots of information. And so some of that information that gets put onto a website that's unreported may get pulled down by an administration, but that would be within the entity itself. And it would be, usually it's individuals that are doing that. But yeah, it's hard to just talk about someone's intent though.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the FDLP is a neutral entity, and what is made based upon what the government is now said and what the government is doing. Excellent. On that note, we've run over, but we try not to, but it happens. I want to say thank you to Will for being here with us today and providing so much wonderful information to the community. I am once again putting our door prize terms word into the chat for those who maybe missed it the first time. And please head on over to the next session, which should be starting soon. I should probably double check what the title of our next session is. We have session number 2 is on reshare. It's the beta testing, documenting deploying as an early implementation in a consortial setting. So thank you, Will, once again, and I'll see you in a week or so. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Miriam.